Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. I want to read something to you to see if you're interested. Here we are, quote, "It's come to the attention of us that the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board is proposing to open a mutual fund window in June. By doing so, it would make available to Thrift Savings Plan participants the opportunity to invest up to a quarter of their savings in 5,000 mutual funds." So what's the problem? Well, the problem is those 5,000 mutual funds include a lot of Chinese companies who aim to actually hurt American citizens, and have companies aimed at building things that would kill and maim American soldiers and sailors. So that's why this innocuous piece of paper from the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board matters to us. And joining me, who shares the concern, is Frank Gaffney, my old friend and frequent partner on his show Securing America on Real America's Voice. Frank is founder of the Center for American Security Policy and vice chairman of the Committee for Present Danger China. Also joining is Roger Robinson, who's also a member of the, I think a founder, Roger, of the Committee for Present Danger China. And Roger's got an extensive career on Wall Street, started out with David Rockefeller back in the day at Chase Bank, worked in the Reagan administration, has extensive subject matter knowledge of capital markets, mutual funds, and how investor dollars should and should be employed. So Roger, welcome. Frank, welcome.
Thank you, Bill.
Frank, why don't you kick this off and frame the issue? I teed it up a little bit, but why don't you give us some more color here?
Well, you, I think, hit the key pieces of it, Bill. The United States financial sector has been putting the funds of American investors writ large into Chinese Communist Party owned and controlled companies for quite some time now. The exact amount of the transfer of wealth that it represents is somewhat of a matter of speculation. I've heard as low a number as $3 trillion, as high a number as 7 or 8 trillion. But whatever the exact amount is, what is clear is such funding transfers have translated into our underwriting of the unrestricted warfare that the greatest danger this country has ever faced, namely the Chinese Communist Party, has been mounting and intensifying in the past 20 plus years. Roger Robinson, our friend and colleague, is a man who has studied this matter closely. He's actually not a member of the Committee on the Present Danger China, just for the record, but he has been a very formidable influence on its work, because we have made something that he's been warning about, well, going back to the era when he worked for Ronald Reagan as his senior director on the National Security Council staff for international economic affairs, that you must not provide cash flow to hostile nations. Back in the day, the Soviet Union, today, the CCP, as it's called. So I'm delighted to have him with us to expand upon the challenge that we're facing here at the macro level, and specifically, Bill, as you said, the extreme inadvisability, not to say outrage, that America's men and women in uniform and other patriotic government employees might soon find their investments in their retirement savings going into some of these dangerous Chinese companies, human rights abusers, national security threats, and the like.
Well, Roger, how does this work? My understanding is there's a basket of mutual funds that include about 6,700 individual companies and they're located all over the world. And then included in that would be about 9% of the investable equity market. And it's interesting, China in that is on the list as an included country among developing countries. The idea that China is developing is a fairly comical one, and only the federal government might think that. It's lodged right in between Chile and Colombia as a developing country. So, Roger, how's this working, and how do we evaluate this and do something about it?
Well, Bill, there's a history to this. As you know, 2 years ago, we faced a similar circumstance with the federal Thrift Savings Plan. The same board of 5, generally former Wall Street figures sitting on it. There was an effort to change the index that basically governs the international fund of the TSP, the Thrift Savings Plan. They were going to move it to the MSCI, All Country World, ex-US to be precise. But the problem there is it was replete with Chinese corporate bad actors, including those sanctioned by the United States for egregious national security and human rights violations. We brought this to the attention of President Trump and Capitol Hill. There was a bipartisan expression of outrage and kind of disbelief that you'd have Chinese military companies being placed, as Frank pointed out, in the portfolios of our sitting servicemen and women in uniform. You can understand the irony. They would have no idea that their retirement dollars were going to be funding the advanced weapon systems designed to kill them and arguably their families. So this is just one element. The human rights angle of genocide, concentration camps, trafficking in slave labor are also implicated. And that was the case 2 years ago. It was narrowly stopped by President Trump, but it was stopped, and abruptly. And there was an instruction that there be no Chinese companies in the federal Thrift Savings Plan. Well, over this period, Wall Street didn't want to take no for an answer. And we basically found that they had selected a new index that included Hong Kong companies, as though Hong Kong is other than just another Chinese city today after the strangulations of freedom there. So we have 35 Chinese companies in the international fund of the Thrift Savings Plan now. This new so-called mutual fund window that's going to be initiated in June multiplies that to an alarming degree, because as you pointed out, these companies, these funds, which have international and emerging market exposure, are generally speaking holding Chinese companies. And again, there's been no differentiation here between those sanctioned bad actors and what you might think of as a more benign Chinese company.
Well, you mentioned Wall Street. That's euphemism for Blackrock. Well, and if you look at the recent minutes of this committee, Kimberly Weaver features large in it. She's one of the, I think, chief operating officer and spokesman for it. And she talked about Blackrock for a couple paragraphs there about how well they were doing. They were 11 basis points over the other indexes, and so there's a specific bad actor here, and it's what BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and the other big mutual funds are doing to influence this. There's another aspect of this, though, that's not just the problem investing in Chinese companies, but also there's no oversight of the Chinese companies by the the PCAOB, which is the Pension Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. And so even if you've got a Chinese company that is pure as driven snow, uninvolved in national security, you still don't know what their financials are. And China is the only country that falls outside of that oversight, and that's another big problem.
It's a black box, Bill, and the sad fact is there's not one Chinese company in the portfolios of scores of millions of unwitting American retail investors that is in compliance with U.S. federal securities laws. That's a fact. Sarbanes-Oxley being the most prominent for the PCAOB angle that you just referenced. So even from a fiduciary and risk management perspective, it's a failing grade. Not to mention, again, the human rights and national security dimensions. And as you could see from the minutes of the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board meetings, they understand the problem that accompanies not one, having ever identified who these mutual funds are, two, zero diligence performed, three, no disclosure of material risks intended for the TSP participants. So, they basically said it's too costly and it would require too many resources to do so. Last time I checked, that's not a very good excuse.
Well, this is not an agendalist driven exercise on the part of the Wall Street firms I referenced. They're eager, and Blackrock has already gone in with a wholly owned entity, as I understand it now. They're eager to get their hands on the investment dollars of the 450 million Chinese with some savings. Right now, they're mainly in Chinese banks, and they want to help. Help in that, and it's a gold mine for these companies if they can get into the Chinese market. So that's, I think, part of the reason they don't want to exclude Chinese companies from the index and why they've been lobbying this so hard. Frank?
Well, I think that is part of it, Bill. Greed operates clearly. But I think you mentioned an agenda, and I think BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, does indeed have an agenda. And that agenda is not simply mutating beyond recognition the financial sector of the United States with his so-called environment, social governance agenda, ESG. He is also deeply committed to this partnership with China, and whether it's getting access to Chinese savings or whether it's just migrating the savings of Americans to China, it doesn't seem to be clearly the former and not the latter. Indeed, he's said he thinks American investors should treble the size of their investment in China at this point. And I guess really, Bill, the thing that, of course, our Committee on the Present Danger of China, of which we're very proud to have you as a member as well, is so seized with is this isn't happening in a strategic vacuum. This is happening in an environment where these entities Roger's described are actually enabling, and whether they're working directly for the People's Liberation Army or whether they're part of the surveillance state apparatus of communist China and engaged therefore in facilitating, enabling, otherwise aiding and abetting human rights abuses, including genocide, or whether they're just so-called civil or private sector companies in China, they all work for the Chinese Communist Party, without exception.
How does the Chinese Communist Party, I mean, we talk about Chinese companies, and what's the mechanism, Roger or Frank, through which the Chinese Communist Party controls these companies?
There are two, Bill, that come to mind right off the bat. Article 7 of the National Security Law in China requires all companies of that country, even the quasi-fraudulent private sector companies, to basically be available on demand from the Communist Party to be, in effect, weaponized. That is, used for intelligence gathering, to assist the Chinese PLA, anything that they have in mind. Those companies must adhere to those instructions. And second, they've actually put Communist Party cells in the senior management structures of all Chinese companies. It's very hard to find an exception. Well, guess why they're there? They're not there because of the coffee and donuts at board meetings. They are there to basically ensure that those companies are compliant with the strategic and military aims of the Chinese Communist Party.
So this is a little bit like the political officers we'd see on all the movies with the Soviet There'd be
commissars.
two people running the submarine, the captain and the political affairs officer.
The hunt for Red October. There it is.
Yeah. So as I understand it, what is it, Section 7 or which one? What's the
Article 7 of the National
Article 7.
Security Law.
That also extends to individual Chinese, doesn't it? Operating or living outside of mainland China?
It does. And I should frame that, just to correct myself, it's the National Intelligence Law, not the National Security Law, which can be confused with Hong Kong. So yes, there's no Chinese citizen who's a free agent here, particularly if they're operating in the United States. They are interviewed and they are instructed as required by the CCP to carry out missions as the party deems indicated.
Well, and our enemy here is the Chinese Communist Party, not necessarily the Chinese people. But if you're just a regular Chinese person living outside of China, the party still expects you to be helpful to their cause. So it's a really ugly situation.
Well, Bill, in a way, just to add to that point, it's almost certainly the case, especially if you're a student here, and there have been something on the order of 300,000 Chinese nationals here as students. You've actually been selected by the party to go to the United States. There are some who've fled successfully Chinese misrule, but by and large, people here in this country from China have the authority of the party to be here. And secondly, whether they expect it or they don't expect it, they will compel you to conform to their dictates, even here in the United States, by threatening your family, all of whom are still left at home. Not all necessarily, but enough. And that's a reason that I think, again, we're looking at this monstrous regime using and weaponizing every instrument at its disposal for the purposes that we've talked about, which are destroying the United States.
So, Roger, Kimberly Weaver tells us that it's way too hard to oversee which mutual funds own which security, and that it's just too much work to exclude these companies. I don't buy it, but what do you think? I mean, how much work would it be to exclude Chinese companies from these indexes?
Well, my firm has done precisely this. We've looked at all the indices and identified those Chinese companies. We've looked at all of the exchange-traded funds that benchmark against those indices. I mean, we can do it as a private sector firm and have done. So the notion that this kind of critical risk-related diligence is too hard and that we're okay putting the hard-earned retirement dollars of our military into black boxes that may well have PLA stamped on them is an outrage. In that connection, it's interesting that the Biden administration, much less the Trump administration before it, issued an executive order in June of last year, Executive Order 14032, that termed the notion of Chinese companies tied to the PLA and the military and tied to surveillance technologies in any way as a, quote, national emergency, and has issued capital market sanctions excluding such companies from even being held by American persons at the threat of violation of law. So how can it be a national emergency in the view of the president and have the same president presiding over this fiduciary irresponsibility of the type that you're discussing right now?
So how do we stop this? And do we have a deadline?
We do have a deadline. We're not sure exactly when it is in June, but I can tell you June is upon us. And what I think we need to go for because of that, Bill, is a postponement. I mean, we need to take the time to do the diligence, to get the answers empirically so that we know precisely what we're looking at. At an absolute minimum, that has to be done. If they try to move forward in this non-disclosure, non-transparent milieu that they've got going now, that can only tell you one thing. We're being stampeded into a non-transparent, covered up event for the very reasons that you mentioned in terms of Wall Street's greed-driven salivating over getting their hands on the savings of the Chinese people and all of the other fees, which are very fat fees, as you know, that are involved with the China portfolio. We can't have greed supersede our fundamental values, our national security, and the protection of retail U.S. investors.
How many I think we've got a fair number of congressmen that are aligned with us on that. Maybe we ought to be thinking about reaching out and supporting them.
Absolutely. That's underway as we speak. In fact, Frank,
I think Rubio's come out. Who else? Mike Lee. Who else has come out on this?
Tom Cotton, Tuberville has come out, and we're expecting a bipartisan letter to emerge from the Senate with any good fortune in the near term. Again, truly bipartisan, to demonstrate that this kind of sleight of hand is perilous to our country and is a very sad and even sickening display of greed over our true national priorities.
And Bill, could I just add, in terms of what you've asked about, what can we do about this? That effort to get support from the Congress is all the more necessary because every single one of those members of Congress in the Senate and in the House has, in all likelihood at least, money invested in the Thrift Savings Plan. So this is their money we're talking about, as well as men and women in uniform, past and present, veterans as well as serving, and other civilian government employees, as we said. This is of concern in two respects. One is, obviously, you don't want them aiding and abetting our mortal enemy, especially if the likelihood is, particularly in the case of the military, but maybe others, the result will be advanced weapons being acquired with that money with which to kill us. But the second thing is, Bill, and this is a point that Roger speaks to very powerfully, and that is the dangers of having the US government, albeit in the form of this federal retirement thrift investment board, which oversees the Thrift Savings Plan, but nonetheless, a federal agency legitimating investments in the kinds of Chinese companies that two presidents, not just Donald Trump, but Joe Biden as well, as Roger said, have in fact put down executive orders saying you may not invest in these companies, these kinds of companies. And so it's really vital that we get this turned off and right quick. And one of the ways we can do it is to get members of Congress.
I want to thank the two of you for bringing this to our attention. I mean, Frank, you and I have talked about it on our show. This is just yet another example of a so-called faceless bureaucrat acting at the behest of, I think, the Chinese lobby to slip something through that I said at the outset sounds really boring. I mean, who cares about your mutual funds, really? Nobody understands it. Unfortunately, I do, and it is a big problem, but it's innocuous. And we talked about this. We've got a bureaucrat at HHS who wants to amend the World Health Organization's bylaws that would call all countries in the world at the sign of a next pandemic to obey the orders of the president of the World Health Organization. Talk some more about that. Was my gratuitous editorial there.
Great segue.
But we need to focus on it. Talk some more about the influence that the Chinese have in the decision making, where people have relatives in China. I mean, the most startling example is Elaine Chao, whose family owns a shipping company in China. And if you want to know why Mitch McConnell is more silent on these Chinese issues than he should be, her family fortunes it depends on the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, there are two aspects to this, Bill. The part that I was describing earlier was kind of the coercive practice vis-a-vis Chinese nationals in our country to ensure that they not only toe the party line, but they serve the interests of the party and the People's Liberation Army and its intelligence services and so on. What you're talking about is the subject, of course, of a terrific book by our friend Peter Schweitzer called Red Handed. The Chinese term for it is elite capture. And there's a sort of coercive aspect to it.
This is their, it's clear. I want to make it clear. This is their term. This is their term. This is an agenda. Exactly.
And it's bipartisan in character. Joe Biden himself, of course, has been deeply compromised, I'm sorry to say. But there are people on both sides of the aisle, and Mitch McConnell's family, I think, is one of them, who have been doing business with the Chinese very lucratively. And it shows in their refusal in some cases, or at least their reluctance to be seen as opposing the Chinese. Sometimes they'll, in a small way, express opposition to genocide, for example, but in the end, they're old friends of China. And that's true of Larry Fink on Wall Street, as well as people in government and academia and so many other walks of life.
And I would just say, Bill, quickly to chime in there on Frank's good observation. Where is the SEC in this? Are they a potted plant? Where is Treasury? Where is the National Economic Council, run by a former Blackrock executive? Treasury's number 2, run by a Blackrock executive. Jay Clayton used to be a Wall Street Journal, Wall Street lawyer that brought Alibaba to market. Steve Mnuchin was very friendly with the Chinese then and now. The long and short of it is we've got a U.S. government regulatory problem here. This revolving door that we've known about forever is now imperiling the United States with multi-trillion-dollar flows from a democracy, namely ours, to a totalitarian police state bent on our utter destruction, aided and abetted by greed-driven Wall Street firms and those conflicted U.S. government regulators that look the other way at moments precisely like this one.
Right. Roger, that sounds like a great summary for where we are. Now, I've got about 20 things on my list here to talk with you two about, but I promised you both I'd get you out of here in a half an hour, and alas, my time is up. Roger, where can we find you? What's the name of your firm and what are your coordinates?
Well, that's in flux right now, as I just fortunately was able to sell my firm. But I will
liquidity event. I love that.
I will be back to you on that matter.
Okay, great. Well, that sounds like a successful exit. That's great. And Frank, I know where to find you, Securing America on Real America's Voice. And what is our other channel that we're on with our show?
American Family Radio Network is where the audio track of the shows that we have the privilege of taping with you each week, Bill, and others appear every weeknight at 11 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, the same time slot that Real America's Voice video is aired.
This has been the Bill Walton Show. I've been here with Frank Gaffney and Roger Robinson talking about why we do not want to invest in Chinese companies. But there's a lot of other things to dig into on the Bill Walton Show and the Frank Gaffney Show. And we hope you'll tune in for our next episodes to find out what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.